right, let's begin this morning. Thank you for being here again. Grateful for the opportunity to teach and learn together. Let's thank the one who has brought us here this morning. Thank you, Lord, for the loving kindness that you have shown to us through Jesus. Thank you for the one who indwells us, your Spirit. Thank you for yourself, who has planned all things with the Trinity from before the creation of the world. We are grateful for the opportunity to live in this life, to think differently than all others, and yet at the same time to love, to accept, to generously give. We are grateful for these opportunities. Amen. Thoughtful Christians and Culture, here's our general tagline for what we've been dealing with. All people think based on their belief. Beliefs inform a person's point of view. Points of view create a culture. Once again, just in case you missed last week and need to catch up, Josh Collingwood is taping all of these things for us. Grateful for his work for us, and you can find all of those sessions on comeniusinstitute.com or .org, either one, or find our website, orphanroof.org. So this morning, I wanted to deal with issues of culture. And if you've been paying attention at all in the culture of binge-watching TV, you know that Jack Ryan is now available to you on Amazon Prime. Well, one of the cool things about Tom Clancy's great books is that he has engaged in all kinds of issues as it relates to military intelligence and counterterrorism and all of those kinds of things. Here you see in the darkened picture here this individual who's making this claim this morning in one of these particular episodes. Actually, it's in the first season of the 6th episode. And there's this conversation going on between the American and between the Turkish individual. And this individual says to the American, "What city were you born in?" And the American says, "I was born in Cincinnati." And after some kind of difficulty of appreciating where people have come from, the man who is of Turkish descent said, "If I was born in a nice American city, I might be the good guy. But now you are a good guy because you are born in a good and nice American city, and I am not." And his comment then is geography is destiny. It's a fascinating statement to make, one that we would perhaps take issue with to some degree or another. It is not our ultimate destiny, of course, but I'm always reminded of things like Acts 17:26, where it says that God has established times and places for all people to live. So in one sense of things, that is true. There is a destiny in geography. Certainly we are, of all people, blessed to live in this nation. So we shouldn't take those things for granted. Here is just one snapshot of culture if you're binge watching television. Here's another one. This comes from a piece that I saw this week. My single friend doesn't understand my married friend, who doesn't understand my pregnant friend. Now, isn't that the truth? We really don't understand what people are going through unless we ourselves have gone through those same things. And so, of course, I relate this to our daughter Chelsea, who has now 4 of her own children, 2 twins, a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old. And one of the social media comments this week was something to the effect of, "Please don't tell me if you're single how tired you are." So I give the woman great high fives for that one. We do not understand what other people are going through. And we certainly do understand that there are phases of life. This, too, is a snapshot of culture. So we're thinking about culture this morning. And then, of course, unless you were living under a rock this week, you have encountered this in one way or another. The accuser, the accusations, the accused, constant news cycle. 7/24, 365 on this one until this is resolved, which it probably won't be for some years and decades to come. But this, too, is a part of our culture. We are living in a political culture at the moment. And then there is this. Sometimes I think we bypass some of these ideas, but just this last week, here is this man, Benikoff, Mark Benikoff, who has just acquired Time magazine. Now, why is that such a big deal? Because he now controls a major publication a major news source, a major news outlet, and we could go on and on about the implications and impact of that. But he wasn't the first, of course. Washington Post is owned from 2013 till now by this man. I think you might know his name, or at least have used his website a time or two, Amazon.com. Yeah, Jeff Bezos. So you have two multimillionaires. In fact, I believe now at least one is a billionaire, if not multi-billionaire. You have these two powerful men who now control two major mouthpieces of American culture. And don't you think that's going to make a difference in what is purveyed through those outlets, the Washington Post and Time Magazine? You better believe it. Absolutely. So the issues of culture are here as well, in publications and the kind of media that we address, the kinds of things that we watch and read and see constantly. All of them are impacted in one way or another by culture. And then, of course, I was thinking about this week. Actually, this is on the right-hand side of the god Ganesh. Ganesh is actually being worshipped recently here by Hindus in India. This was a mainstream media report this last week. We don't really pay too much of attention to the rest of the world, so I wanted to pay attention to the rest of the world this week. I wanted to show you in India this week, the Hindus are worshiping the elephant-headed god, Ganesh. Now, I mention that to you because maybe you don't know anything at all about this particular god, but perhaps we ought to. Perhaps we ought to know more about what's going on in the culture of our world as a whole. But then there's this picture on the left-hand side. These are two NPR reporters. This actually happened this last week as well. The people behind the NPR reporters are military men from the nation-state of North Korea. And if you looked closely, if you could see closely at this particular picture, the faces of these gentlemen looking at these women are not nice. In fact, what was really interesting as I read the report from the NPR reporters was that their political minders constantly made them shift and change throughout their visit to North Korea. And I think they probably would even take issue with the word visit because they're not so sure that it was really a visit so much as a handling of you can go here but not there. This too is an issue of culture, how people live. And so we get snapshots of this throughout our week. Doesn't matter what we're talking about, what we're dealing with. We are engaging a cultural background and backdrop that we need to understand and address. So, since it's football season and I love football, I thought I would mention this. This is from Gretchen McKay from the Chronicle of Higher Education. And she wrote this: I had football players in my class. They were all starters. I watched them, their excitement and their energy level. I'm going to do something to get that into my class. Here is a PhD in a Division III school who is now going to be excited about teaching in an active learning environment. Why is that? Because she has football players in her class. Because they are active and they're excited. And when they go out and play football, it's a very exciting time. So she's going to invest in that kind of approach because she has football players in her classes. What's kind of really cool, by the way, is if you want to go and check her out and check out this particular article, what's really fascinating is that she has become a mentor to these football players. I think that's really neat. You spend time with people like she is doing. Here you see her cheering them on as they come out of their locker room onto the field. She's cheering them on. Here is a PhD, and she is actually invested and involved in people's lives. She is invested and involved in the culture of football. Culture is important. So, what is culture? Here it is. A bunch of Latin words all rolled together. Culture comes from a word which means a field or garden needing cultivation from a farmer on an estate in a colony, creating a culture or civilization which gives honor or veneration to its beliefs or institutions, creating a way of life. That's what culture means, all of that. By the way, for those of you interested, all of these statements, the most important things are in your handouts, as they are every week. You'll see this there as well. I emphasize this kind of concept of culture because you'll notice that it crosses over various aspects of life. You'll see the issue of place. So you've got a place that you're needing to be cultivating. You're talking about the person who is cultivating, the farmer, and then you're talking about beyond this, the region in which this is being cultivated. But what it leads to is a way of life, a way of thinking about life that's different simply because of the culture that you're in. So if I would flash back through all of the slides I just showed you, culture in North Korea is very different than the culture in India than is the culture in the United States of America. Everyone has a culture. In fact, I would go so far as to say everyone in this room has a culture, an individual culture, because you are in one way or another in a home, which is your own culture. Robin and I have a culture. Robin and I have been together for 39 years. Married, of course. Make that clear. And what's really fascinating to people when they find out that we've been married for 39 years after they are just really surprised by this, that's a long time, they say, well, how are you doing in this, for such a long time? And we tell them that we laugh a lot together, which is part of our culture. So our culture in our house is to enjoy each other's company and laugh a lot. That might be different for you, I don't know. But everybody's got a culture. Every home in this room has a culture. So, where do we go from here to consider the issue of culture? Let's take the workplace culture, for instance. Culture, distinguishing features, have to do with history, geography, time, language, beliefs. It's a way of life. And in the workplace culture, we say that culture eats strategy for lunch, and probably breakfast and dinner as well. What that means is it doesn't matter what a great strategy you have in a workplace, unless you thoroughly understand the culture in which you are living and the people that are in your workplace so that you can treat them well and that you can actually produce a good product or whatever it is that you do in your workplace. This is a famous line in the workplace world in which we live. Culture eats strategy for lunch. Doesn't matter how many great points you have nailed down, unless you have a good culture in your company. That is, the place is good, the person that's involved in the oversight of it, administrating it, is doing well, and then the whole company as a whole, this way of life that's been invested in, is crucial. Well, what does all of this have to do with a biblical view? How do we as Christians engage this? Well, if you remember from last week, we talked about this idea that Christian doctrine makes Christian distinctiveness, and I talked about Creed from Rich Mullins' famous work, and I believe what I believe is what makes me what I am. I did not make it, no, it is making me. So the great question then becomes, are we allowing our culture to make us, or are we allowing Scripture to make our culture? That's a crucial question, a crucial concern, and that's where we engage this world in which we live. So, is culture or Scripture making me? We're going to run back through the 5 ideas that we started with last week. They're also listed again on your pages this week. Theology should drive our sociology. That is, how we live should be driven by how we believe, not the other. We emphasize that sociology is not to drive us. Our sources of knowledge should shape our knowing. We begin with Scripture without apology. We have an unconscious impact. Those things that are our knowledge source have an unconscious impact on conscious thought. We'll talk about examples of that. Biblical principles should be permeating everything that we think or do. And then finally, intentional application of a life view to life. How do we literally put this into practice? That's our crucial concern. So, let's take some examples of this. Let's take, for instance, the culture of money as a way of life. Now, American views of money are very different than what Scripture teaches about money, and we don't have a whole course on money here this morning, but just a snapshot of this. American views of money are very different than what Scripture teaches about finance. So when we think about American views of money, are we being led by the American culture, or are we actually investing time in Scripture to see what Scripture teaches about how we deal with money? So, for instance, American Christians' giving of money last year in 2017, this is the stat from last year, Christians give 2.5% of their income to churches and nonprofits. And it's estimated is that if every Christian in every church was giving 10%, at least the so-called tithe, which is a whole other discussion, but if people were giving at least 10%, every church and every nonprofit in the United States of America and around the world would be fully funded. Wow. So, have we allowed the culture of money in America to unconsciously impact our conscious thought? Have we done that? This is how culture invests itself and invades our own thinking. How about this, the culture of authority, a way of life? Whenever I was teaching students who were going into the classroom for the very first time to be student teachers, the last thing I would tell them is this. I would hold my open palm like this, and I would say, I would put a pencil, or in this case, my fast forwarder in my hand, and I would say to them, this is authority. You hold authority loosely in your open hand because you're dealing with young people, little ones. You need to treat them with gentleness and graciousness and care. And as soon as you close your hand around this authority, it becomes power, and you beat people with it. Allow authority, which has been given to you, to rest in an open hand, and not close it and beat people with your authority. So, one of the greatest administrators I ever had, in fact, the greatest administrator I ever had, in any setting, whether it be junior, senior high, undergrad, or grad school. His name is John DeLine. Now, John taught me a lot of things about being an administrator, not the least of which was the very first time I ever engaged him in an overview of my teaching. I was with him for 6 years, and this was the only time that he ever actually gave me an evaluation of my teaching. So he brought me into his office, and he sat me down, and he sat across the table from me, and he smiled at me, and he said, "Do you know what my job is?" I said, "I don't know. What's your job?" And he said, "My job is to hire the best people and then get out of their way." He stood up, opened the door, and let me leave. And I floated down the hall back to my classroom. Why was that? Because he esteemed me, he encouraged me. He was one of those people that actually took his authority not for granted, but believed it to be very important. And in fact, intentional. Notice, here's our fifth overview point of this whole series, intentional application of life view to life. Here was a man who actually believed that an administrator had a responsibility to the people that he administrated, that he managed, his teachers, and he cared about. A culture of authority. How do we function in authority? And then I think about a culture of compassion. These pictures a little bit dark. This is Jennifer and Winnie, and there's Dr. Clyde and myself over there with them. We had them on the radio show this last summer. Jennifer actually teaches with Robin, and Jennifer has for years been invested and involved in immigrant help. That is, helping immigrants actually make the connection into the American culture. And Winnie was with her, and in her broken but wonderful English accent, she was talking about what a great manifestation of Christian love this had been to her and her family, and the issue of compassion and help, and why that was so imperative to her, and what that meant for them into the future. It's these kinds of testimonies from Christians around Indianapolis that really weigh on us and show and demonstrate a way forward, I think, for how we should live and respond in culture. So here's our fourth principle for the series, biblical principles that permeate everything, certainly true for Jennifer's life, certainly true in the way that she conducts herself in helping and reaching out to those who are new to our country. So one of the things that I thought would be important for us to recognize is this concept of what was it like in the Second Testament, that is at the beginning, the first century, when the church just began. One of the key writers about anything that has to do with the first few centuries of Christendom is a man by the name of Rodney Stark. Rodney actually teaches at Baylor University down in Texas. He's written a number of books. The Triumph of Christianity is one of his best. I think it came out in 2011. This is an older book back in 2006 called Cities of God. And the subtitle is The Real Story of How Christianity Became an Urban Movement and Conquered Rome. So when I was thinking about how do I explain how either culture influences us or we influence culture, I thought, let's go back to the first century church. And here are at least two of the ideas that he brought forward in this book. First of all, Christianity spread because of sea travel and Roman roads. Sometimes we think that somehow Christianity spreads because we have these huge conventions of people that walk the aisles and raise their hand and turn in cards. That was not necessarily the case. Christianity spread in large cities through all of these avenues, but here's the real way that Christianity spread. It spread not through mass conversions, but through the example and witness of everyday believers. Everyday believers. So when I think about everyday believers, I think about folks like appear at the backside of Romans chapter 16. And I wanted to note a couple of these ideas here in Romans 16, because these are passages that we honestly don't think about reading much or kind of skip over, kind of like the genealogies. That's another discussion. But nonetheless, Romans 16, check this out. All of these places and people that Paul is reading here. And I wanted to read one in particular. There's a whole list of these, starting in verse 3 of Romans 16. And in verse 13 it says, "Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, also his mother, who has been a mother to me as well." Isn't that cool? Here's this woman who demonstrated her care and concern, not just for her son, but for one who she adopted as a son. Romans 16:13, a wonderful statement about this witness of everyday believers in the first century church. So, what does this look like then for us? Here we are in the city of Indianapolis. I've noticed, or noted here on the top right-hand corner, the circle, basically, which is 465, around the city of Indianapolis. And I did this so that I could remind us all of how many roads come in and out of this city. You've got 69 going north. I heard news reports of maybe they would have the one all the way down to Evansville done in the next couple of years. You've got 70 east and west, 74 east and west, 65 north and south. There's a reason why this city is called the Crossroads of America. Because all of these major thoroughfares come right through our city. This is the reason why they're always doing construction on 465. That's a whole nother discussion. Here's just a sight line of our city, some of the major buildings in Indianapolis. And here's a picture of the campus center at IUPUI, down here on the bottom section of this. I point this out to us because Indianapolis is the 16th largest city in the United States. Now, this only encompasses Marion County. If you took in Noblesville and Fishers and Zionsville and Greenwood and all the rest, just imagine how many people live literally right in the center of this state. We have a world-class university at IUPUI, which is going to become, if it hasn't already, the largest university in the state of Indiana. And we are considered to be the crossroads of America. So think about this. Go back and think about this. How did Christianity spread? Through all of these travels, through large cities, and through the example and witness of everyday believers. And here we are in the crossroads of America, in a large city, in one of the places where people come in and out at a major university in Indianapolis. So, on the back side of this handout, I've given us an overview, a real quick overview of what does it look like to consider culture from a Christian point of view. And I want to say this very definitively, because I think sometimes we kind of think if we just start doing good things, then this is a demonstration of our Christendom. Not necessarily. Remember, if you're allowing your sociology to drive you to your theology, it's backwards. It needs to come the other way. So there's two basic ideas that's coming out of this handout on the backside. The first is at the top, that we are sinners. And bottom line, all of that verbiage and all those passages there, we're sinners. We desperately need salvation from outside of us, which is the whole point to the second section of the backside of this handout. And what should happen, of course, because of our salvation, because Jesus has changed us, is all of the stuff that you'll notice here. Look at number 2, for instance. God will place His law in our mind. Number 3, we are made new in our thinking. The process of renewal is continual. Number 4, the product of renewal is concise. It's a pattern of renewal that's broad in number 6, and then it shapes our attitudes as well. All kinds of passages that you can check out and look up to see those things through. One of the great statements, I think, that comes our way as it relates to this has to do with the great King Josiah, of whom it was said in 2 Kings 23, Josiah turned to the Lord with all his heart, soul, and might, according to all the law of Moses. So here's a person who's thoroughly changed, not just in his thinking, not just in his being, but also in his behavior and his actions. Then, of course, I mentioned Romans 16 already, this concept of investing in other people's lives and how Paul was invested in theirs. And then this last one is the one that is actually the baseline for our radio show, which is to do good, do good, do good, all the way through the book of Titus. It'll take you 5 minutes to read Titus, and you'll see the word good 9 times in that book. It's a very important word that helps us to understand our responsibility. What are we to do now that we are believers in Jesus? So, I wanted to give some examples of what does it mean to be an everyday Christian. Here is a great snapshot of church history from Catherine and William Booth, who founded the Salvation Army. Actually, if you want to come to my house sometime, feel free. I'll show you right above the door that you walk in is a huge poster behind glass, a 1918 poster, World War II poster, or World War I poster of the Salvation Army handing out biscuits in England. Very important group, of course. I mentioned Joyce Pillar. Joyce was a friend of my mom's, a friend of our family, a friend of mine. Just before she died, she asked me, what did I want from her home? And I said, I want that poster, that World War I poster. And so now it's literally above the door that you walk into our home to help everybody to remember what a great group this is and what great work the Salvation Army has done. Robert Fulghum is my favorite humanist. I have a favorite atheist, and I have favorite humanists, and I have favorite lots of people. But anyway, this is my favorite humanist, Robert Fulghum. I would love to meet him someday and have a chat with him. In his book, he writes the story about his father that was changed by the Salvation Army, who was the only group that came to his aid when he had lost his home and his family was destitute. And to this day, Robert Fulghum still rings the bells at Christmas time as they are collecting change. Robert Fulghum. The Salvation Army, snapshots of everyday Christians who have made a difference in culture. Here's another one that you might have seen on the news perhaps, the 10-Point Coalition. Our friend Charles Ellis on the left-hand side of this picture has just passed 2 weeks ago. A dear friend of ours. We miss him. Looking forward to the next time we see him. And then Charles Harrison continues to be front and center, the major person that you see whenever the 10-Point Coalition is broadcast on television news broadcast. Great pastor of United Methodist Church in the city. These are the folks who are on the front lines who literally walk from about 10 at night until 6 in the morning through communities so that people who might be given to gun violence will look at these yellow flags on the backs of these individuals and think twice about shooting somebody in the inner city of Indianapolis. The 10-Point Coalition has literally grown up over the last dozen years and is now being utilized in places like Louisville and Cincinnati. And folks from around the United States are coming to view this. Even Jeff Sessions came this past year to find out about the 10-Point Coalition. This is the kind of thing that happens when everyday Christians participate in culture. And then there's this wonderful group called Truth at Work, which is really doing fantastic work because what it does is it takes the workplace, folks who are in the workplace, and does wonderful things, gives them the opportunity to engage in thoughtful Christian thinking about how do they think differently as people, as Christians, or even if they may not be Christians, and how that influence might make a difference in them. Their big conference is coming up Friday, November 9th. You'll want to make sure to get a chance to be at that. And then, of course, Kevin Sorbo will be coming in as well. And we actually have the privilege in our church of having one of the co-founders of Truth at Work, Matt Phelan, is here. Thank you, Matt, for your good work. We're grateful for all that you do. Everyday Christians Folks who just decide, this is how the Spirit's motivated me to make a difference in the culture. So, applications. Again, from last week, but they bear repeating. Biblically based life view. Biblical principles should be applied within our culture. We should have an appreciation of Christian cultural leaders throughout church history. We should have opportunities for cultural impact. And by the way, that's driven by the Spirit who has engaged us in the things that we have been given to do in our passions. And then number 5, to evaluate cultural ideas through a Christian mindset. Our responsibility. Remembering, of course, on the back side of that handout again, we begin in sin, we are changed through Jesus, and that's what makes the change. Our theology makes the change in sociology. So from here, the applications then go to, are we going to be a scripturally based cultural influencer? I would suggest some ideas here. One is that we need to be with people to do this. We can't do this by distance. I really struggle with the whole concept of pure distance learning, simply because there's a difference when you are with people, when you are teaching and learning in a context, in a community. That's a huge issue. There needs to be a content-based but activity-centered point of view. And that activity-centered point of view is based on the content of what we're actually teaching and caring about. Jesus' sacrifice drives us to accept people, no matter who they might be, what they look like, where they've come from, what language they speak. Our responsibility, Scripture teaches us these things. We need to listen to other people and ask questions. Francis Schaeffer probably said it best. In an hour-long conversation, we should listen 55 minutes and talk for 5. And those 5 should be spent asking questions. And then finally, El Shaddai, the one who provides all things, attending to the needs of others. How do we think about how we apply our responsibilities of seeking out the needs of others and then actually addressing them? So, for years and years and years, for millennia, people have been talking about this, going all the way back to Plato and Aristotle. And there's this triad that's been used again and again and again, and maybe you've heard of it. It's called truth, goodness, and beauty. And this triad of words has been used over and over and over again. And I think we've been saying it wrong all along. I think we ought to do it this way. We ought to show beauty, we ought to do good, and then maybe, just maybe, somebody will want to hear about our truth. If we reverse it and we focus on truth and just try to tell people what to do, in this culture, they ain't flying anywhere. In this culture, we must demonstrate beauty, demonstrate good, and then maybe people will want to know, where does this truth come from? So, as we do each week, questions, where do we go from here? And if you have others, feel free to highlight them. Don't have to stick to these. The first is, how can Christians live in a culture that holds different beliefs? We're going to continue to highlight this, but it's one question that comes up even today in this particular session. How should Christians identify themselves in such a culture? Is it based on what kind of pin I wear on my lapel? Do I have bumper stickers on my car? How do I demonstrate my distinctiveness as a Christian? Should we be at home in this culture? Should we feel comfortable here? That's an important question for us to address. What does comfort mean, especially in this country? And then a real long one. How do we avoid the misuse or abuse of cultural principles while not becoming a recluse, that is, keeping to ourselves, who refuses and recuses, not wanting to be involved, himself, from involvement on the earth that God gave and the culture in which we were placed for this time and space? I really think about this for myself a lot. I really enjoy alone time. I'm sure all of us do to one degree or another. But I always fight with myself about becoming a recluse. That is, just kind of drawing into myself and not participating with others. And it's one of the greatnesses, I think, of the opportunity to even teach at IUPUI this year, and I'm grateful for that. For the opportunity to be in a public setting, to make a difference in the lives of young people as it relates to reading, writing, and thinking. Those are important ideas. So being in the public sphere, how do we participate? How do we practice our Christianity in those ways? Some questions for us to consider. We've got a few minutes. Questions, thoughts, something that came up here you want to discuss, ideas, concerns.
What comments do you have on your topics here in combination with political divisiveness?
Yes. My one-word answer would be civility. One of the great memes in the New Testament, and I emphasize that, it's a meme, it literally was. If Peter was writing it today, you'll all be preaching this soon, I'm sure. 1 Peter 2, 13 to 17, in that 17th verse, it says that you're supposed to honor the king. That is a fascinating word by itself. And the responsibility is to honor then all men. One of the really cool things that we do on this radio show that we have, Dr. Clyde Posley and I, this last week, for instance, we dealt with the Supreme Court nomination. And Dr. Posley is a progressive liberal Christian, and I'm a perennial conservative Christian. And we had a civil conversation. And you know what people are most surprised at? That we don't yell at each other. So, can Christians do this? Yes, I believe we can, together. How do we engage a culture that is divisive by itself? My general response would be stay out of its way. Let people are going to say what they're going to say, do what they're going to do. I think we ought to abide by the concept of respect and honoring people that are in positions of authority, and also being generous and gracious to people whose lives in some way or another have been shaken by events.
Along those lines, I found it difficult but helpful at times to remember that everyone is made in the image of God. Sometimes it's too easy when we get into conversations, and I avoid those online blogs because of this. It's too easy to get into an argument, whether it's political divisiveness or something else. But if you remember that everyone, atheist, humanist, pagan, whatever the label is, they're still made in the image of God. There's still a remnant of the conscience that is put into each of us.
The image of God. I couldn't say it any better.
I was going to say an important statement I read this week mentioned that the fruit of the gospel is not the same as the gospel, and that there's so many worthy movements that happen that maybe dovetail in with the gospel, but if people walk away from that experience or seeing that done without knowing why or the foundation behind it, I mean, you can't say be good because you're supposed to be good. Why are you supposed to be good? Why? What is the ultimate foundation behind these things?
That's right. Yeah. Who says? Ephesians 2, 8, 9, these are crucial statements in Ephesians. We're saved by grace through faith, not of our own. We don't work for this. And then verse 10 is really crucial. We have been created to do good works because of the work that Jesus has done through us. So you have to have grace through faith first before the good works come. That's why theology needs to drive our sociology.
Are you going to deal with the problems that the West is now having, basically with the East in this? You know, I think one of the things that's happened in, especially in our time, maybe the last 50 to 100 years, is we've had a decisive cultural break where the West has left any shared meanings of the past and are just out here floundering, where the East hasn't done that. And we have a big breakdown right now.
Yeah, you know, Dennis's question, comment is really kind of a foreshadowing of, you're right, some of the things that we want to talk about. One of them is what, again, Francis Schaeffer used to refer to as the cut flower syndrome. As soon as you cut flowers, we all know this, and put them in a vase, they last for a while, and you can even sprinkle in that white stuff that they give you. You know, I don't even know what that does, but I do it, you know, when I get flowers. It supposedly keeps them longer. But eventually they die. The same is, of course, true with those things that are outside, but we see flowers that have roots last for a very long time. And so when you don't have any root any longer, we'll deal with the issue of the rootedness of not just the West, but I think of Christendom itself. Any other questions, please?
Mark, when you deal with the issue of privacy, I think of, like, even in HIPAA laws, we're not allowed to know what is going on in someone's lives, or corporations that have a paternalistic view can sometimes be viewed in conflict. You're treating someone in this way versus someone who didn't share it.
And so,
How do we show beauty when our laws allow for such privacy, and or if we do,
yeah, you're getting.
we have implications for that?
Yes. You would have to ask a really hard question.
I just asked a yes, no question, will you? You can say no.
See, as soon as you ask, these are great questions, all of you. The first thing I want to do is spend the next 40 minutes explaining all of that. You know. The issue of how do we demonstrate goodness and beauty to people in a culture where we have all these laws restricting us is a very, very difficult process and problem. As soon as we think that we're doing something good, somebody takes us to task on it because it is indeed something that infringes on their privacy or rights or something. We have, in this culture, to navigate a thinner and thinner stream of common grace. And that we have to manage this in a very difficult way, but one that still gives us, I think, an opportunity to do good. And generally, my response would be, I think if we do good to the whole, then maybe this would filter into the private person's lives. I don't envy the position that you're in because you deal with those kinds of things on a regular basis. Will we deal with this? To one degree or another, yes. But it's a really good question and one that is fraught with difficulties. As you
May I give a personal example?
Yeah, please.
We had a very difficult week this past week. Our son does not take his insulin as he should, so he was in the hospital. He was in intensive care at one point. We were there about a week, and he's involved in drugs and lives completely against anything we've ever taught him. But I rubbed his back, I rubbed his temples, I did whatever I could do to show him Christ's love. He still doesn't want anything to do with Christianity. Bill helped him get out of a tub and into bed. We showed the love of Christ every way that we could. We have to show the love of Christ to those that do not know him. And it's hard to do. It's hard for many Christians to love the very unlovely, but that is what we are called to do.
Moms and dads and their children in particular.
But then we see his friends that have nasty t-shirts that say horrible things. The home smells like marijuana, but we are there and we show them the love of Christ. And wherever we go with him, we show his friends, we have them in our home for dinner. And we have to do that if we're going to reach the lost.
Beauty and goodness. Maybe the truth. Thanks for being here this week. See you next week.